Margaret Thompson sat in her small bedroom staring at the faded photograph on her nightstand. It showed her late husband, Robert, holding baby Michael, both of them grinning at the camera. 43 years ago, that picture was taken in their first little apartment in Ohio. Now, at 68, Margaret could barely recognize the woman she used to be. She had given everything to that little boy in the photo. When Michael was 6 and needed surgery for his appendix, Margaret worked double shifts at the diner to pay the medical bills. When he wanted to play Little League, she sold her grandmother's jewelry to buy him proper equipment. During his college years, she took out a second mortgage on their modest home to cover his tuition. Every sacrifice felt worth it because she believed in the unspoken promise that family takes care of family. After Robert died 3 years ago, Margaret thought she'd have time to grieve, to figure out her next chapter. Instead, Michael appeared at her doorstep with Sarah, his wife of 2 years, presenting what they called the perfect solution. Their house was too small for a growing family, they explained. Sarah was pregnant with their first child. They needed more space but couldn't afford the down payment on a larger home. "Mom, you're all alone in this big house," Michael had said, gesturing around the 3-bedroom ranch where he'd grown up. "It doesn't make sense for you to keep paying these expenses when we could all be together. We could be a real family." The plan seemed logical, even generous. Margaret would sell her house and contribute the proceeds toward a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in the suburbs. In exchange, she'd have her own room and bathroom, help with the new baby, and never feel lonely again. Sarah had smiled warmly that day, calling her mom and talking about how wonderful it would be to have Margaret's wisdom and experience around. So Margaret had said goodbye to the house where she'd raised Michael, where she'd shared 35 years of marriage with Robert, where every room held memories of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and quiet Sunday afternoons. She packed up 4 decades of life into boxes, keeping only what would fit in one bedroom of someone else's house. The colonial was everything Michael and Sarah had promised. Hardwood floors, granite countertops, a huge backyard perfect for children. Margaret's room was nice enough, smaller than what she'd had before, but clean and functional. She told herself she was lucky to be wanted, lucky to be useful again. When baby Emma arrived, Margaret threw herself into being the perfect grandmother and helper. She woke up for the 2 a.m. feedings so Sarah could sleep. She did the grocery shopping, the laundry, the cooking. She researched organic baby food recipes and child-proofed every corner of the house. When Sarah went back to work part-time, Margaret became Emma's full-time caregiver without ever being asked if that's what she wanted. "You're such a blessing, Mom," Sarah would say occasionally, usually when she needed Margaret to watch Emma on short notice so she could meet friends for dinner. Margaret lived for those moments of acknowledgement. She told herself that this was how families worked. Everyone contributed what they could. Her contribution was her time, her energy, her retirement savings that had made their comfortable life possible. She convinced herself that love was often shown through actions rather than words. But gradually, things began to shift. Sarah stopped calling her mom and started using Margaret in a tone that somehow managed to sound both polite and dismissive. When Michael's work friends came over for barbecues, Margaret was introduced as Michael's mother who lives with us, rather than as part of the family. During family discussions about vacation plans or home improvements, Sarah would send Margaret upstairs to check on Emma, just as the conversations got interesting. The little things accumulated like paper cuts. Sarah began buying different groceries than what Margaret put on the shopping list, explaining that she preferred organic options that cost twice as much. Margaret's favorite chair in the living room was moved to a corner to make room for Sarah's new furniture. The family photos on the mantel were gradually replaced with pictures that featured only Michael, Sarah, and Emma. Margaret told herself these were normal adjustments. Every household needed time to find its rhythm. She focused on Emma, who was walking now and calling her Gam Gam in the sweetest voice. At least someone in this house still lit up when they saw her. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Margaret was folding laundry in the basement. She heard Sarah on the phone upstairs, her voice carrying clearly through the heating vents. I don't know how much longer I can deal with this, Sarah was saying. She's always hovering, always offering opinions about how I should raise my daughter. And Michael just lets her because he feels guilty. I mean, I'm grateful for the help with the down payment, but I didn't sign up to have a live-in babysitter who thinks she runs the house. There was a pause as the person on the other end responded. Exactly, Sarah continued. It's my house now. I should be able to raise my child without someone from a different generation undermining every decision I make. The baby doesn't need to be held every time she cries, but Margaret can't seem to understand that. And don't get me started on the cooking. Everything has to be made from scratch, like we're living in 1950. Another pause. I know. Michael says we can't just ask her to leave because where would she go? But honestly, at this point, that's not my problem anymore. I've been patient long enough. Margaret's hands had gone still on the towel she was folding. She felt as if she'd been punched in the stomach. All those months of being helpful, of being grateful for a place in their lives. And this was how Sarah really felt. She was a burden, an inconvenience, someone to be tolerated rather than welcomed. That evening, Margaret watched Michael and Sarah interact during dinner. She noticed how Sarah's comments about the food were always slightly critical. Too salty, too heavy, not the way her mother made it. She saw how Michael nodded along with whatever Sarah said, never defending the woman who had raised him, never acknowledging that Margaret's presence in their home came with benefits they took for granted every single day. After dinner, as Margaret cleaned the kitchen alone while Michael and Sarah watched TV in the living room, she made a decision. She wouldn't confront them. She wouldn't create drama or make demands. Instead, she would pay attention. She would watch and listen and finally see the situation clearly. Over the following weeks, Margaret began to notice things she'd been too grateful, too hopeful to see before. Sarah never thanked her for the daily childcare that would have cost them hundreds of dollars per week to replace. Michael never acknowledged that his mother's financial contribution had made their comfortable lifestyle possible. They made family plans without consulting her, then informed her of decisions that affected her life as if she were a tenant rather than a family member. The guest bathroom, which had been designated as Margaret's bathroom, became the place where Sarah stored extra toilet paper and cleaning supplies. Margaret's few remaining photos of Robert were moved from the hallway to her bedroom because Sarah said they clashed with the decor. When Margaret suggested they plant a small garden in the backyard, something that had always brought her joy, Sarah dismissed the idea, saying she preferred low-maintenance landscaping. Most painful of all was the way her relationship with Emma began to change. Sarah started interrupting when Margaret was reading to the toddler, calling Emma away for snacks or nap time just as they were getting settled together. "Emma needs to learn independence," Sarah would say. "She can't be attached to Gam all the time." Margaret felt herself becoming invisible in her own family, a ghost haunting the life she'd helped create. The woman who had once been the center of a household, who had made every Christmas magical and every birthday special, was now treated like an unpaid employee whose services were taken for granted. But she said nothing. She swallowed her hurt and continued washing dishes, caring for Emma and pretending that everything was fine. Because what choice did she have? At 68, with most of her savings tied up in a house that wasn't really hers, where could she go? What kind of life could she build? The answer to that question would come sooner than she expected, in the form of a coffee cup that smelled like something other than coffee. It was a Thursday morning in March, when everything changed. Margaret had spent the early hours doing what she always did, emptying the dishwasher, starting a load of laundry, preparing Emma's breakfast. Sarah came downstairs around 8, her usual time, looking polished and put together in her work clothes. "Good morning, Margaret," Sarah said, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced cheerfulness that Margaret had learned to recognize. It was the voice Sarah used when she wanted something. "Morning," Margaret replied, not looking up from where she was cutting banana slices for Emma's high chair tray. She'd learned to keep her responses brief to avoid saying something she might regret. "I was thinking," Sarah continued, opening the expensive coffee maker that had replaced Margaret's simple drip machine months ago, that maybe we should talk about making some changes around here. Margaret's hand stilled on the banana. In her experience, conversations that started with making changes never ended well for the person with the least power in the situation. What kind of changes? Margaret asked carefully. Sarah busied herself with the coffee maker, not meeting Margaret's eyes. Well, Emma's getting older now. She'll be starting preschool in the fall, and Michael and I have been talking about our long-term plans for the family. The words hung in the air like a threat. Margaret felt her chest tighten, but she kept her voice steady. I see. Don't worry, Sarah said quickly, as if sensing Margaret's tension. We're not talking about anything immediate. We just want to make sure everyone's needs are being met as Emma grows up. You understand? Margaret understood perfectly. She was being given notice that her usefulness was coming to an end. Once Emma started preschool, there would be less need for full-time childcare, less reason to justify Margaret's presence in their home, less guilt about asking her to leave. Of course, Margaret said, her voice remarkably calm given the storm of emotions building inside her chest. Emma's needs should always come first. Exactly. Sarah smiled, the kind of bright, meaningless smile that never reached her eyes. I'm so glad you understand. You're always so reasonable about these things. Reasonable. The word stung because Margaret knew what it really meant. She was reasonable because she had no choice but to be reasonable. She was reasonable because she was dependent on their goodwill for a roof over her head. She was reasonable because fighting back would only make her situation worse. I thought I'd make us both some coffee, Sarah continued, turning back to the machine. We could sit and talk more about this. I want to make sure you feel heard in this conversation. Margaret watched Sarah measure out the expensive organic coffee beans they'd started buying after Margaret's simple Folgers was deemed too harsh for Sarah's taste. Everything in this house had been upgraded to Sarah's preferences, purchased with money that had come from the sale of Margaret's home. That sounds nice, Margaret said, though nothing about this conversation sounded nice at all. Sarah worked at the coffee maker with unusual attention to detail, taking longer than necessary to prepare their cups. She added cream to both, then reached into the cabinet for something Margaret couldn't quite see. I'm making you a special one, honey, Sarah said, stirring Margaret's cup with a spoon she then immediately placed in the dishwasher. Just a little something extra to help you relax while we talk. The endearment felt wrong coming from Sarah's mouth. In all the months they'd lived together, Sarah had never called her honey. The forced sweetness in her voice set off every alarm bell in Margaret's head. When Sarah handed her the mug, Margaret accepted it with a polite smile, but something made her hesitate before taking a sip. The coffee smelled wrong. Not bad exactly, but different. There was an underlying odor that didn't belong, something vaguely medicinal that had nothing to do with coffee or cream. Aren't you going to try it? Sarah asked, settling into the chair across from Margaret with her own mug. I added a little vanilla extract. I thought you might like something sweet. Margaret brought the cup closer to her nose, pretending to savor the aroma while actually trying to identify what was causing that strange smell. Vanilla extract didn't smell like this. This was something else entirely. It smells lovely, Margaret lied, setting the cup down on the table. But you know what? I just remembered I should check on Emma first. I thought I heard her stirring upstairs. Sarah's smile faltered slightly. Oh, but she's still sleeping. I just checked on her myself, and I really think we should have this conversation now while we have some privacy. The insistence in Sarah's voice sent another warning signal through Margaret's mind. Why was it so important that she drink the coffee right now? Why couldn't their conversation wait until later? You're probably right, Margaret said, standing up as if to move toward the stairs. But you know how I worry about her. I'll just take a quick peek and be right back. Margaret, really, she's fine, Sarah said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. Please, just sit and drink your coffee. It'll get cold. but Margaret was already moving, and as she passed behind Sarah's chair, she made a split-second decision that would change everything. With movements practiced from months of cleaning up after others without being noticed, she swiftly swapped their mugs, placing Sarah's cup in front of her own seat and taking what had been Margaret's cup to Sarah's place. "You're right," Margaret said, settling back into her chair and picking up what was now Sarah's original mug. "Emma can wait a few more minutes. This conversation is important." Sarah looked relieved as she reached for her coffee, the coffee that had originally been prepared for Margaret with whatever special ingredient had created that strange smell. "Perfect," Sarah said, raising the mug to her lips. "Now, let's talk about the future." Margaret raised her own cup, the one that had been meant for Sarah, and took a careful sip. It tasted like normal coffee with cream. No vanilla extract, no strange aftertaste, no medicinal undertone. Just coffee. She watched as Sarah drank deeply from her mug, apparently eager to fortify herself for their difficult conversation. Margaret continued to sip her coffee slowly, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. Whatever Sarah had put in that original cup, whatever had caused that strange smell, Margaret was now certain it hadn't been vanilla extract. The question was, what had it been? And why had Sarah been so insistent that Margaret drink it? "So," Sarah said, setting down her mug after several long sips, "like I was saying, we need to think about what's best for Emma as she gets older." Margaret nodded, keeping her expression neutral while every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. Of course. Emma's well-being is what matters most. They continued talking for several more minutes, Sarah outlining her vision for Emma's future education and social development. But Margaret noticed that Sarah kept reaching for her coffee cup, drinking more than usual, as if the conversation was making her nervous. About 20 minutes into their discussion, Sarah paused mid-sentence, blinking rapidly as if trying to clear her vision. "Are you feeling all right?" Margaret asked, though she kept her voice carefully neutral. "I'm fine," Sarah said quickly, but her words sounded slightly slurred. "Just a little tired. I didn't sleep well last night." Margaret watched as Sarah gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white with effort. A thin sheen of sweat had appeared on Sarah's forehead despite the cool morning air. "Maybe you should lie down for a few minutes," Margaret suggested. "We can continue this conversation later." "No, I'm fine," Sarah insisted, but even as she spoke, she swayed slightly in her chair. "I just need a moment." Margaret felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. Whatever Sarah had intended for her to consume, it was now working its way through Sarah's system instead. And based on Sarah's rapidly deteriorating condition, it was something far more serious than a simple sleep aid. "Sarah, I really think you should—" Margaret began, but her words were cut off by the sound of Sarah's mug crashing to the floor as Sarah's hand suddenly lost its grip. "I don't feel good," Sarah whispered, her voice now definitely slurred. "Something's wrong." Margaret stood up, her heart pounding as Sarah slumped forward in her chair. The woman who had spent months making Margaret feel unwelcome in her own family was now completely helpless, the victim of her own carefully planned scheme. For a moment, Margaret simply stood there, looking down at her daughter-in-law, understanding with perfect clarity that everything she had suspected about her place in this family was true. She wasn't a beloved grandmother and mother-in-law. She was an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved. And Sarah had just shown her exactly how expendable she really was. Margaret moved quickly but calmly, her nursing instincts from decades ago kicking in as she assessed Sarah's condition. Her daughter-in-law was conscious but disoriented, her pupils dilated and her breathing shallow. Whatever Sarah had put in that coffee was powerful, and Margaret realized with crystal clarity that this hadn't been meant to make her sleepy for a difficult conversation. This had been meant to incapacitate her completely. "Help me," Sarah mumbled, trying to stand but immediately losing her balance. Margaret caught her arm, steadying her back into the chair. "I'm going to call 911. Margaret said, reaching for her phone with one hand while keeping the other on Sarah's shoulder to prevent her from falling. "No," Sarah said weakly, grabbing at Margaret's wrist. "Don't. Michael will—" But Margaret was already dialing. As the phone rang, she looked down at the broken mug on the floor, the coffee spreading across the tile in a dark stain. Evidence. She needed to preserve this. 911, what's your emergency? I need an ambulance, Margaret said calmly. My daughter-in-law appears to be experiencing some kind of poisoning or drug reaction. She's conscious but disoriented. As she gave the dispatcher their address and answered questions about Sarah's symptoms, Margaret's mind was working furiously. She carefully picked up the intact pieces of Sarah's mug with a dish towel, placing them on the counter. The coffee maker was still on, the carafe half full of what appeared to be normal coffee. But whatever Sarah had added to Margaret's original cup was now coursing through Sarah's system instead. "Ma'am, can you tell me what she might have ingested?" the dispatcher asked. Margaret looked down at Sarah, who was now slumped in her chair, eyes unfocused. "I'm not sure. We were having coffee together when she suddenly became ill." It wasn't a lie, exactly. They had been having coffee. Margaret simply omitted the part about switching the cups. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, and Margaret watched as they assessed Sarah's vital signs and asked rapid-fire questions about her medical history and what she might have taken. Sarah was barely coherent, mumbling incoherently about being tired and not feeling well. "Has she been under any stress lately?" one of the paramedics asked Margaret as his partner started an IV line. "Some," Margaret replied carefully. "We were just discussing some family matters when she suddenly became ill." They loaded Sarah onto a stretcher, and Margaret rode with them to the hospital, playing the role of the concerned mother-in-law perfectly. She called Michael from the ambulance, her voice appropriately worried, as she explained that Sarah had suddenly become very sick, and they were on their way to the emergency room. At the hospital, Margaret sat in the waiting room while doctors worked to stabilize Sarah. Michael arrived 20 minutes later, his face pale with panic. "What happened?" he demanded, grabbing Margaret's hands. "You said she just collapsed." "We were having coffee and talking," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. "She seemed fine at first, but then she started acting confused and dizzy. She couldn't stand up properly." Michael ran his hands through his hair, the same gesture he'd made as a child when he was upset. "Did she say anything? Did she complain of feeling sick?" "She said she was tired, that she hadn't slept well," Margaret replied. "But Michael, she was asking me not to call for help. She seemed almost afraid of something." This was true. Sarah had tried to stop her from calling 911, though Margaret suspected it was because Sarah knew exactly what was wrong with her and didn't want medical professionals asking questions about what she'd ingested. They waited for 3 hours before a doctor finally came out to speak with them. Dr. Martinez was a kind-faced woman in her 40s who looked tired but professional. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Dr. Martinez. Your wife is stable now, but I need to ask you some questions." Michael stood up immediately. "Is she going to be okay? What's wrong with her?" "She's going to recover fully," Dr. Martinez assured him, "but we found traces of a sedative in her blood work, specifically a combination of diphenhydramine and another compound that we're still identifying. The levels were significant enough to cause the symptoms she experienced." Michael looked confused. "A sedative? But how?" "She doesn't take anything like that." Dr. Martinez glanced at Margaret, then back at Michael. "Could she have taken something accidentally? Mixed up medications, perhaps? Or—" She paused delicately. "Has your wife been under any unusual stress lately? Sometimes people take things to help them sleep or relax without realizing how dangerous they can be in combination." Margaret watched Michael's face as he processed this information. She could see him trying to make sense of it, to find an innocent explanation for why his wife had powerful sedatives in her system. "I don't understand," Michael said finally. "Sarah doesn't take sleeping pills. She's always been proud of sleeping naturally." "Well," Dr. Martinez said gently, "the good news is that she's going to be fine. We'll keep her overnight for observation, but she should be able to go home tomorrow. However, I would strongly recommend that you look into what happened here. Accidental poisoning is serious, and if there are medications in your home that could cause this kind of reaction, you need to secure them properly." After the doctor left, Michael slumped back into his chair, looking defeated. "I don't understand any of this, Mom. How does someone just suddenly have sedatives in their system?" Margaret placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Maybe she's been more stressed than she let on. You know how Sarah is. She likes to handle things herself, doesn't like to worry other people." "But sedatives?" Michael shook his head. "Where would she even get something like that?" Margaret had her suspicions about where Sarah might have obtained such substances, but she kept those thoughts to herself. Instead, she focused on being the supportive mother-in-law, the woman who had rushed to help in a crisis. When they were finally allowed to see Sarah, she was awake but groggy, connected to monitors and looking smaller than Margaret had ever seen her. Sarah's eyes found Margaret's immediately, and for a moment the two women stared at each other across the hospital bed. Sarah knew. Margaret could see it in her eyes, the confusion, the growing realization of what must have happened, but Sarah couldn't say anything, not with Michael there, not without admitting what she had planned to do. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Michael asked, taking Sarah's hand. "Confused," Sarah said slowly, her voice still slightly slurred. "I remember having coffee with Margaret, and then everything gets fuzzy." She looked at Margaret again, and Margaret met her gaze steadily. "The doctors said you had some kind of sedative in your system," Margaret said calmly. "They think you might have taken something accidentally." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "I don't remember taking anything." "Well, you were very tired," Margaret continued. "You mentioned not sleeping well. Maybe you took something to help and forgot about it?" It was a lifeline, an opportunity for Sarah to accept a face-saving explanation that would avoid difficult questions. But Margaret could see the wheels turning in Sarah's mind, the growing awareness that somehow the tables had been turned. They stayed at the hospital until evening, Michael never leaving Sarah's side. Margaret sat quietly in the corner, knitting a baby blanket she'd brought for Emma, the picture of a devoted grandmother waiting patiently for her daughter-in-law to recover. But inside, Margaret's mind was working furiously. This incident had revealed something crucial about her situation. Sarah hadn't just been planning to ask her to leave. She had been planning something much more permanent, much more final. The amount of sedative in Sarah's system could have been lethal for a woman Margaret's age, especially if she had been alone and unable to call for help. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. Margaret finally understood that she wasn't dealing with a difficult family situation that could be resolved through patience and compromise. She was dealing with someone who viewed her as an enemy to be eliminated. That night, after they returned home and Sarah was settled in bed under Michael's worried care, Margaret sat in her small room and made a decision. She had spent months trying to make herself smaller, more accommodating, more useful. She had convinced herself that if she just tried harder, gave more, asked for less, she could earn her place in this family. But today had shown her the truth. There was no amount of giving that would ever be enough. There was no level of usefulness that would guarantee her safety. Sarah saw her as an obstacle to the life she wanted, and obstacles needed to be removed. Margaret pulled out her laptop and began researching. She looked up the value of her financial contribution to the house purchase, calculated what her share of the equity would be worth now. She researched senior housing options in the area, apartment rentals, and financial planning for people her age. For the first time in months, Margaret felt something other than resignation or sadness. She felt clarity. Over the next few days, as Sarah recovered at home, Margaret watched the household dynamics with new eyes. Michael fussed over his wife, bringing her tea and asking repeatedly if she needed anything. Sarah milked the attention, claiming she still felt weak and disoriented from her accident. But Margaret noticed other things too. She saw how Sarah watched her when she thought Margaret wasn't looking. the calculation in her eyes as she tried to figure out exactly what had gone wrong with her plan. She saw how Sarah's story about her symptoms kept shifting slightly. First she remembered nothing, then she remembered feeling dizzy, then she remembered Margaret helping her sit down. Most tellingly, Sarah never asked Margaret about the details of what had happened. A truly innocent person would have been curious about those lost hours, would have wanted to understand how they had ended up in the hospital. But Sarah asked no questions because she already knew the answers. Margaret began making quiet preparations. She contacted a lawyer about her financial interest in the house, speaking hypothetically about a situation where a parent might need to reclaim their investment in an adult child's property. She researched apartments and made discreet inquiries about availability. She also started documenting things. She took photos of her living conditions, the cramped room, the bathroom that had become a storage space, the areas of the house where her belongings had been relegated. She saved text messages from Michael and Sarah, especially ones that showed how her role in the household had evolved from family member to unpaid servant. But most importantly, Margaret began to change how she interacted with them. She stopped anticipating their needs before they expressed them. She stopped jumping up to help with every small task. She began saying no to requests that were unreasonable or that interfered with her own well-being. "I can't watch Emma tonight," she told Sarah when asked to babysit on short notice so Sarah could go out with friends. "I have plans." She didn't, but that wasn't the point. The point was establishing that her time had value, that she was a person with her own life rather than a convenience to be utilized. Sarah's reaction to these small changes was immediate and telling. She became snippy when Margaret didn't jump to help with household tasks. She made passive-aggressive comments about how some people seemed to be getting comfortable with letting others do all the work. But Margaret no longer cared about Sarah's approval. She'd seen exactly what Sarah thought she was worth, and it had nothing to do with how helpful or accommodating she was. 2 weeks after the hospital incident, Margaret made her final decision. She was sitting in her room reading bedtime stories to Emma when she heard Sarah and Michael talking in the hallway outside her door. "I think she knows," Sarah was saying in a low voice. "Knows what?" Michael replied. "About what happened. The way she looks at me. And she's been acting different, less helpful." "Sarah, you're being paranoid. She's been nothing but supportive since you got sick." "That's just it," Sarah said. "She's being too supportive, like she's pretending. And some of my things have been moved around. I think she's been going through my stuff." Margaret hadn't been going through Sarah's belongings, but the accusation revealed something important. Sarah was feeling guilty and suspicious because she knew she had something to hide. "What are you suggesting?" Michael asked. "I'm not suggesting anything," Sarah replied quickly. "I just think maybe it's time to have that conversation we talked about making changes. Emma's getting older, and I think we all need more space." Margaret continued reading to Emma, her voice steady despite the conversation happening just outside her door. But inside, she felt the last piece of doubt fall away. Sarah was going to keep pushing until Margaret was gone, one way or another. The only question was whether Margaret would leave on her own terms or wait to be forced out. That night, after Michael and Sarah had gone to bed, Margaret sat down at her laptop and wrote an email to the lawyer she had consulted. Then she opened her bank account online and began transferring money to a new account she had opened at a different bank. She also wrote a letter, not to be sent now, but to be ready when the time came. It was addressed to Michael and explained in calm and factual terms what had really happened the morning Sarah had gotten sick. She detailed the strange smell in the coffee, the switched mugs, and Sarah's suspicious behavior, both before and after the incident. Margaret didn't know if she would ever need to send that letter. She hoped she wouldn't. But if Sarah escalated her campaign to get rid of Margaret, if she tried something else, Margaret wanted to have protection. For now, though, Margaret was focused on her exit strategy. She had learned something valuable from Sarah's failed attempt to remove her. The person who controls the narrative controls the outcome. Sarah had tried to create a story where Margaret simply disappeared from their lives, leaving them free to enjoy the house and lifestyle that Margaret's money had made possible. But Margaret was going to write a different story. In her version, she would leave with dignity on her own terms and with what was rightfully hers. She would take her granddaughter's love with her, and she would take her financial contribution to their comfortable life as well. 3 weeks after the coffee incident, Margaret found the perfect apartment. It was a 1-bedroom place in a senior-friendly complex about 20 minutes away, with a small balcony overlooking a garden and a community room where residents gathered for activities. It was smaller than anything she'd lived in since her early 20s, but it was hers. She put down a deposit without telling Michael or Sarah. The next morning, Margaret began the process of quietly reclaiming her life. She contacted a moving company and scheduled them for a day when Michael and Sarah would both be at work. She notified her bank and other important services of her upcoming address change. She even found a part-time job at a local library, something to give her days structure and purpose beyond being an unpaid caregiver. Margaret Thompson, who had spent the last year of her life being diminished and dismissed by people who owed their comfortable lifestyle to her generosity, was about to remind them exactly what they stood to lose. But she would do it quietly, without drama or confrontation. She would simply disappear from their lives the same way they had been trying to make her disappear from theirs, except she would be taking her contributions with her. As Margaret fell asleep that night, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: anticipation for the future. For the first time since Robert's death, she was looking forward to tomorrow.